All right, so I'm finally, and it's actually like a week later, getting around to recording the other parts to this. So, what I wanted to do was kind of recap very quickly what some of the big ideas were from the first 20 minutes of this. The big thing is going to be kind of the I guess the issue with the Whig Party, how they managed to get Harrison into the White House by using kind of some of the same tactics we'd seen with Jackson, except that when he dies, again, think about Northup, that you've got Tyler coming in and really kind of abandoning the ideas that the Whigs, particularly Henry Clay, had. The big issue there is that Tyler, was always kind of he was used to round out the ticket, I guess you could say. And so when he represents a different perspective or a slightly different angle for the Whig Party. And so that's part of why he abandons that. And then you've got Texas. You've got the issue with Texas independence. Remember that Texas is about slavery. We forget, because Texas did a pretty good job in the late 1800s, early 1900s of remaking its image, so that its image was one of the West and the cowboy. But that was not always the case. It was really Confederate, really slave-owning, cotton-producing, that kind of thing. And we'll touch on that periodically later on, but that's definitely a piece of the puzzle. And then you've got the idea that Texas is brought in by a congressional resolution, the fact that this becomes an election issue in 1844, and the most notably that Henry Clay really kind of loses his shot to become president over the Texas issue. That's what makes Polk so appealing to people, because he's talking about expansion. He's talking about, yes, America should be coast to coast. America should take this territory. We should include Texas. We should do this, really kind of ignoring the slave issue, really kind of continuing the myth that we could kind of continue to have one free, one slave, one free, one slave, as far as states are concerned. And so I think that's kind of an interesting kind of an interesting angle there, that this is what causes the Whigs to lose. And so we go from that to Polk being the president in 1844, winning the election in 1844. He's inaugurated in 1845. Remember, at this point, the presidential inauguration is in March. That does not change until FDR, until after the 1936 election. So you have Polk coming in 1845, and he brings with him these same old ideas that we've seen with the Democratic Party going back to Jackson. And the idea of smaller tariffs, and the idea of lots of expansion westward. But the one change you do see, now the Democrats don't change their mind on the constitutionality of the bank. So we don't see a national bank being created, but there is some legislation that creates an independent treasury to kind of provide a little bit of stability into the economy. And they're going to focus on moving westward. We've got issues with Oregon, you've got issues in California, you've got more and more Americans, even though Oregon and California aren't technically the United States at this point, people are moving there anyways. This real sense that, hey, nobody's telling us no. Again, Americans like land expansion. We really kind of embrace that idea. And one thing that you see from having read that Crevecoeur is going to be this notion that, or pointing out Crevecoeur, that, what is an American? That Americans just tend to have that idea of, yeah, I think I'd like that, and going to take it, and don't tell us no. So that's kind of interesting. Now, Texas as well was a situation where the Mexican government had not recognized Texas independence, even though we were our own government set up and that kind of thing. And, they didn't recognize us, but they weren't actively trying to take us back either. So, make of that what you will. but technically, right, there was a dispute over exactly where the border was. And I'm trying to reach back into my Texas history. I know Texas claimed it went to the Rio Grande. And I think Mexico was claiming it was the Nueces River, I believe, which is much farther north, several hundred miles or a couple hundred miles, something like that. Um, and so that was where the dilemma was. So what will happen is that Texas will station some men in this kind of no man's land where that Mexico is claiming as part of theirs, and this will entice Mexicans to come over and say, "Hey, get out of here." So it's Mexico defending their borders, ironically, against Texas. And that's going to trigger the Mexican-American War. Now, this will happen after Polk has been aggressively going after, Oregon, going after California. Polk wants those territories, and he's not made any secret about that. Everybody knows. So it's not really a big surprise that Mexico goes, yeah, no, we're not doing that. And then you have this incident along the Texas border. And so that's going to make kind of a big deal. And when we declare war, you have Polk giving one of these grand speeches about, oh, how dare they attack the Americans, and Americans have lost their lives, and this is so awful. We can't let this insult stand. A lot of that. The term is called jingo. It's basically a term that's very nationalistic kind of talk. That we're the best, we're the greatest. How dare somebody insult us? So he's going to give that kind of speech, and Congress is going to go, yeah, we're all for that. And the American public largely does too. There's nothing like a good war to distract us from economic concerns, right? And so that's what's going to happen. So we very quickly invade Mexico, and we attack Veracruz. This is where Zachary Tyler comes in. This is, Mexican-American War is where a lot of the guys that will then be the generals during the Civil War, this is where they cut their teeth. These guys are coming from West Point and that kind of thing. And the Citadel. They're coming from those places and to go fight. So you have all these young men fighting in this war. And ultimately, the U.S. kind of kicks butt is what happens. And so they're able to kind of negotiate the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which basically means that we forced Mexico to sell us Utah, Nevada, California, and Colorado, and to settle the Texas border at Rio Grande. I suppose you could argue that, hey, Mexico got money for it, except Mexico didn't want to sell those things. And so we basically held them up in a way. I suppose that depends on your perspective. Some people would argue that we had every right to do what we did, and there certainly was an altercation between Texas that had become a state and Mexico. So there were Americans that were killed. It can depend on how you want to look at it. So this is really what's going to create the continental United States. So the Mexican-American War is a pretty important aspect. So if we're thinking in terms of, what things matter as we're moving westward, it's going to have to be the conditions that allow Texas to come into the Union. Because if Texas had not been allowed into the Union, you wouldn't have the Mexican-American War. And so that's step one. Then we have the Mexican-American War. And that's going to give us all of this territory that we then have to administer. Except the problem with all this territory now, right? It sounded like a great idea. Yes, more territory, more expansion. Except we can't agree about slavery. There's real divisions about slavery and the type of economy that we want. And now all we've done is add more territory to that. So one of the most interesting things, this is actually a lesser known kind of development, is the Wilmot Proviso. The Wilmot Proviso is presented to Congress right as this Mexican-American War, Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo stuff is coming down. And it basically says that newly acquired territory cannot have slavery. This is part of that movement of the anti-slavery Whigs and the anti-slavery expansion Democrats. And I think it's important to kind of explain for a second that it's the Whig Party that's really kind of divided between factions that are completely anti-slavery. We don't want any slaves in the United States, or, so we either want to abolish it or we want to come up with an answer about it, which we'll be talking about that later. And then you've got people that are like, well, we just want to stop it from expanding. All right, if we can just stop it from expanding, let the states that already have it keep it, and then we'll start kind of moving westward, right? And so that's kind of one of the things that you see happening is that you have that division. The Democrats are going to be more divided between people that think slavery should go wherever people want, and then the groups that are more willing to keep up with this kind of balance system, or maybe even have a few limitations on Western slavery. So I think it's important to understand that the Wilmot Proviso is kind of the first big crack, I guess, in this system of compromise, because it basically doesn't compromise. So when we think about everything going back to the Great Compromise that said slaves were 3/5 of a person, right? Even if you go farther back to the Declaration of Independence where they strike out the slave passage, now you've got the 1846 Wilmot Proviso that essentially says, you know what, we don't want to compromise on this anymore. And this is going to be kind of the beginning of the trouble. Now, we wouldn't have had a need for that had we not had all this territory that we had to then figure out what to do with. And so this is going to just be a whole part of the trouble that's going to be brewing later on. And I don't know that I've mentioned, so, ultimately what happens with Texas and Oregon is Oregon comes in as a free state and Texas comes in as a slave state. And I believe that's going to be kind of part of the Compromise of 1850, if I remember correctly. So you have, this is just a picture of Zachary Tyler. If my husband were here, he could tell me lots of interesting little anecdotes about Zachary Tyler. And I think, was it Zachary Tyler's daughter marries Jefferson Davis, and then she dies very early on, something like that. Of course, Robert E. Lee fights in the Mexican-American War. Ulysses S. Grant fights in the Mexican-American War. I believe Stonewall Jackson did. Like, you have a whole bunch of famous names from the Civil War that learned to fight in this particular conflict. And Americans really do kind of show up and, kick butt and take names. So what we see happening now that we essentially have all this Western territory is this notion of migration. And migration is really the product of the market economy and the fact that you've had boom and bust cycles. And of course, part of those are created thanks to Jackson and the destruction of the bank. But also the very nature of the market economy is one of frequent fluctuations. This is one of the things, we underestimate the benefit that we have because we have economists now that can study centuries of economic data, essentially, and come up with an idea for how things tend to work. And so this is how we have an understanding about, in certain situations, the government shouldn't spend, in other situations, the government should, and there's some things that it's worth the deficit that is acquired because spending on this will ultimately create more wealth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One of the classic examples of that is going to be public education, that investing in public education is worth it because it creates a better society that is then able to be more productive workers, just for an example. So this boom and bust cycle that's driven by the market economy grinds people under its wheels, especially when you look at the fact that in the 1830s and 40s, understanding of these economic factors is minimal. First off, there's not a lot of data at this point. You've got Adam Smith in the late, 1700s, but even at the time he was cutting edge, right? So you've got lots of questions about how do we balance these things? How do we make these things work together? And people artisans that can't make it in this new emerging factory system, farmers who are struggling in a commercialized agricultural system, those people that are feeling frustrated are then going to be attracted to the Western territory. And that's definitely what you see going on. That's why people were moving to California and Oregon early on, long before the U.S. said, yeah, we really want that. And so up until like the mid 1840s, you have people moving westward. You have frontier people. You have this increasing movement going towards Colorado and the Rockies and the Great Plains and all that kind of stuff. But what will happen is that once you get to the mid 1840s and this issue with Texas being brought in, the settling with Oregon, the end of the Mexican-American War, what happens is the idea of manifest destiny. And you guys should remember this from 8th grade, because that should be a big concept that is driven home in 8th grade. Manifest destiny is the idea that America was destined to control North America. It's most often used in the context of an evangelical sort of way, that God intended, divine providence, if you will. And so that's kind of the notion. And the manifest destiny underneath it has a lot of what we would call Anglo-American superiority. It's, we're going to see this again when we get to the later 1800s and we start looking at the U.S. going into Hawaii and into the Philippines, and then as we become increasingly, aware of global situations. A lot of that is the American, now they call it American hubris, if you will, or American ego. But it's the notion that our system is the best and that we need to force our system onto other people. I'm certainly a proponent that America is the greatest country out there, even when we're not doing things right, even when we're making democracy look messy, we're still the best country out there. And I certainly believe that. But you cannot deny the fact that Manifest Destiny had this really kind of racist idea to it, that Indians needed to move, that, Mexicans that were still in California, or the Californios or the Tejanos. There's a period in this like 1850s where, there were Tejanos that had been a key part. I mean, the best one is Juan Seguin, right? I mean, he basically loses everything because the Texas government, especially once it becomes a part of the United States, has this attitude that he's a Mexican, therefore he doesn't deserve any of this land. He doesn't deserve to have a position. So there's some mistreatment of some of these people. And a lot of that's driven by racism. And again, American racism has been an issue since the 1600s, and we see that kind of continuing. But it really kind of heats up, and when we get to Manifest Destiny, because it talks about America's the best, and the perception there was it was white America that was the best, and of course that kind of assumption that hey, we're entitled to this comes from the movement of people crossing these borders even long before it was a part of the United States, and this is going to increase the tension with Native Americans. It's no mistake that by the time you get to 1860, we start to see some real conflicts with Native American tribes. In fact, in the 1840s and 1850s, this is when you have some of the most significant conflicts with the Comanche in Texas. So there's a lot of kind of interesting side notes there. And I'm far from a specialist in Native American history. But this is where that really starts to get difficult. This is a famous painting that really depicts everything there is about Manifest Destiny. This is actually one from later in the 1800s. You can tell from the telegraph wire that this kind of goddess is carrying with her. But you can see that she's kind of driving out the Indians, she's driving out the buffalo, she's driving out the darkness, and then coming behind her is civilization, is the light, is the train, is the telegraph, are the farms, and then on that kind of cusp traveling with her are going to be the pioneers and the frontiersmen and that kind of thing. So again, this is kind of depicts like the post-Civil War Western migration, but it's the same concept, and it's a very famous picture that you should associate with Manifest Destiny. And also, I mean, it depicts what I mean by Anglo-American superiority, that this idea that our way of life was superior, that the way we were dealing with things was superior. So I like to point that out. One of the next things I'm going to do is talk about 1848. You're going to see that the Democrats are going to have a little bit of a division again over the slavery. This is where the Free Soil Party is going to come from. That this is kind of a part of the group that would have supported the Wilmot Proviso. And these people, this is why I pointed that out, this is where that division starts coming in, that the idea of compromise just isn't working anymore. And so you've got these broken apart political parties. And, there's so many comparisons we can make to to the 2016 election process, with parties being very seriously divided over key issues and how do we handle key things. And I would suggest that it's because, you look at this part of the mid-19th century and there's a lot of profound changes taking place. You've got, factory systems, you've got financial systems, you've got territory acquisition. You've got really what is becoming a globalized economy, except I think it's so early in the process that nobody understands that it's becoming a globalized system, and it's creating tensions that people don't know how to handle. And so they're arguing over issues like slavery, which, true, should be argued about. I mean, that's one thing you should have gotten from the de Tocqueville discussion, which is that slavery really kind of runs counter to many of the core beliefs, core values of American society. And, so if we're looking at that, it makes sense that slavery would be a key issue, but understand that they're also dividing over other things as well. So the Democrats are divided. That's going to create a problem. You're going to see the Whigs going back to kind of that, what worked with William Henry Harrison, what they had seen work with Andrew Jackson, that we'll get a general, one who's kind of rough and tumble. Matter of fact, his nickname was Rough and Ready. I was reading somewhere that Zachary Taylor, I think I put Taylor, I should have put Tyler, it's Zachary Tyler. Matter of fact, I'm going to change that while I'm talking. Zachary Tyler was the guy that, or is it Zachary Taylor? No, all of a sudden I'm blanking. It's Tyler. I knew I was right. Sorry. Thought process as we go. So you have Tyler, who really doesn't have, this is not somebody that's known for reading and writing. We'll put it that way. Matter of fact, I'm not 100% sure how literate he was. I'm not going to go on record as saying that he was illiterate. I just know that he didn't, he tried to he was one of those crusty old guys that was like, oh yeah, the newspapers and the politicians and that kind of thing, right? So he's very much that sort of person. Well, what will happen is that he kind of comes in and he lets himself kind of be branded by the Whigs as this kind of pro-market person, pro-internal improvements, pro-financial stability, which really are all issues everyone could agree on. Right? They wanted a financial system that wasn't subject to whims. So everyone had kind of begun to figure out that this idea of no government control over the economy wasn't a good thing. And then you're going to see them talking too about, this idea of roads and railroads and how important those are. So people are agreeing on those things. And so the Whigs are going to get Tyler. They're going to bring him in. And use him as their candidate. The Free Soil Party will pull votes from the Democrats. This points out that classic third-party effect. You've got to remember that. I know that especially in this election, we've seen a lot go on about how you should be able to vote third party. That to not vote third party doesn't necessarily mean that the wrong side's going to win or anything like that. And, I'm not sure that I buy that, and everyone's entitled to make up their own mind. So my opinion about it, I guess, is really pointless. But I do think that if you look at the historical examples, you do see that there is a third party effect that happens. Hopefully one day we'll have an example that proves this wrong. I would love to see that, but, not yet, anyways, or it hasn't happened yet, rather. So you definitely see that the Democratic Party is going to be split. Tyler's going to come in. He's going to be talking about having no slavery in California. And I can't remember to what extent I talked about California. California kind of had an interesting, like almost kind of Texas, revolution kind of thing, right as the Mexican-American War was breaking out. But California had been settled by people who didn't really buy into the whole slavery issue. Of course, they didn't have to because they had a number of Indian groups that lived there, so they took advantage of the Indian groups, who by this time had a little more exposure to European diseases, and they also had a lot of Mexicans that they took advantage of. So for them, the issue of slavery was different. Plus, the agricultural system in California is a little bit different, so it didn't end up relying on the heavy use of slaves like, say, Georgia or Texas did. So one of the interesting things I found about Tyler was that Tyler is actually, and I was telling my husband that, if Tyler had lived throughout his entire administration, I wonder what would have happened, because Tyler, there begun to be some rumbles because he supports this free California, right? And you have these kind of rumbles about secession. And Tyler goes on record as very clearly saying, you guys try that nonsense, and I'm going to come down there and I'm going to whip your tail. And of course, that's Ms. Green's variation of what he said. But essentially, he was very much a no-nonsense guy, right? And so he's all about the market and internal improvements. But he's not going to, he's kind of like Jackson in that sense. Don't tell me that you get to nullify stuff and that you get to do what you want and you get to secede, because that's not going to fly. And he was really outspoken. And if there was somebody that could have really coalesced a diverse group of people behind him, it would have been Tyler. Now, part of that's because he tried to kind of keep his head above the political fray, but also because he was a war hero. And so what's going to happen is that he kind of eases the issue with California a little bit, and everyone kind of shuts up on the secession talk, but then he's going to die. And when he dies, he's replaced by Millard Fillmore, who is not exactly your most dynamic leader in the world. And so consequently, Fillmore is going to work with Henry Clay to pass the Compromise of 1850. So I think that is a major factor there. So I'm going to kind of pause this here because I'm looking at my clock and I've probably been going on for about 26, 27 minutes. So I'm going to stop it, and I'm going to pick up back with Western migration and then talking about the Compromise of 1850. Big things you need to remember from here is going to be the Mexican-American War and the Wilmot Proviso, and kind of how that tends to work, as well as the fracturing within the Democratic Party that allows Tyler to win again.